Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Immigration History Research Center's event covering immigration in an election year. We're so happy that you're able to join us virtually. You should all be especially happy to be joining us virtually if you're not in Minnesota, because it is snowing outside right now. So thank you for joining us. Before I introduce all of our speakers, I want to go through a few housekeeping items. First, please know that this webinar is being recorded. We are going to have a question and answer session at the sort of tail end portion of this event. You can go ahead and use the Q&A function on your Zoom to put in your questions throughout the event, and we'll get to them at the end. You can also choose to submit questions anonymously if you do not want your name to be mentioned when the question is posed. I'm Erica Lee. I direct the Immigration History Research Center here at the University of Minnesota, and we're so excited for this conversation today. We organized a similar event almost exactly 4 years ago. I think it was either the week before or the week after the 2016 presidential election. We had a lot to talk about then, and I know we're going to have a lot to talk about today. And I'm particularly thrilled to have Dara Lind and Ibrahim Hirsi joining us today because, in my opinion, they're writing some of the very best, most important immigration stories that we all rely upon in this dizzying news landscape where immigration news seems to be coming to us from left and right, and it's so hard to keep track of everything. I'm going to first introduce Dara, and she's going to open up the program for us. Dara Lind covers immigration policy for ProPublica in Washington, D.C. Before coming to ProPublica, she spent 5 years as Vox's immigration reporter. She is also a regular co-host of the Vox podcast, The Weeds. She's been covering immigration in some form since the end of the George W. Bush administration. And again, you need to check out her website, her stories. We're putting that in the chat box link so that you can see some of the breaking coverage that she's been doing. Dara, welcome to our webinar.
Hi, I've unmuted myself, but there we go. The question of who was starting my video is a little bit fraught. Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Lee. Thank you to the IHRC. It's actually really funny to hear when I say that I've been covering immigration since the end of the Bush administration, it's a little bit weird to be saying that to a Minnesota audience, because I count that by going back to when I was doing my undergraduate senior thesis research. I spent a summer in the Twin Cities and was observing the immigration court in Bloomington, which happens to be right on the light rail right before the Mall of America stop. In case anyone is super interested in doing some, immigration court tourism when things are back on campus and more passable. But so I'm a little bit bummed that I don't actually get to go check that out, because I was doing this work and saying, oh, I'm going to be writing about something that's going to be totally obsolete because I'm going to be writing this thesis in spring of 2009, and Barack Obama is going to get elected and he's going to fix immigration, and like all of these court backlogs and other things that everybody has been talking about for years are going to get fixed. And instead, of course, it's actually been somewhat useful for me to have that background to draw on, because some of the problems that have come up during this administration have been those that have been kind of buried like landmines in the system, that weren't a crisis, that have never been quite a crisis enough to actually force action through. Congress tends to react only to the things that it absolutely needs to. And so much of what we've seen in the immigration system, and there are certainly ways in which the Trump administration has been an aberration here, but there are also ways in which what's happened has been that things that have always been kind of just sub-crisis level have finally gotten to a point where it's too difficult to ignore them, or there's finally been enough of a political constituency for kind of attention to them to become a little bit more salient than it used to be. It's really interesting to, I mean, it's kind of wild for me personally to be talking about immigration in an election year this year, partly because when I went from Vox to ProPublica a year ago, a lot of the reason that I was doing that was because I was not looking forward to another campaign cycle getting dominated by immigration. And I was really hoping to focus on what the government was actually doing instead of, you know, what candidates or campaigns or other people who weren't actually running the machinery of government said it was going to do. The other irony is that immigration hasn't been as front burner an issue as I think a lot of people would have expected. Certainly not as big an issue as it was in the 2018 midterms, arguably not as big an issue as it was in 2016 when President Trump was initially elected. It's a little bit weird to think about because I don't think anyone's changed their assessment that the Trump administration has still been doing a ton on immigration. But it does make it a little bit hard to cover in DC because one of the realities of political journalism is that you talk about policy when there's a presidential campaign in particular, when there are bills actually being discussed in Congress, and then when there are other things that might be of particular salience. Like, yeah, a lot of stuff changes through regulation, but the regulatory period is super stretched out. You'll have the time when the proposal gets made, you have an open comment period, then they go, you know, home with the comments and read them for several months, and then ultimately you have a final rule and then something goes into effect. Nothing in there is necessarily big enough to be like, okay, everybody drop what you're doing. This is the thing that I have to be covering right now, or this is the thing you should be reading about. The presidential campaign often does kind of pose that sort of opportunity for political journalists to take a big look at what has happened, what a candidate would do. And we've seen some of those efforts with the current campaign. It's really freaking hard with immigration because immigration is like multiple policies at once, right? There is a respect in which the immigration system that the federal government runs is the largest law enforcement operation that the federal government runs. CBP, which is Customs and Border Protection, which is responsible for the, you know, keeping unauthorized people and goods from entering the country and with enforcing the law near the border, which is a little bit legally expansive, if you will, and ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is responsible for interior enforcement, as well as some of the investigatory work, either involving immigration or kind of involving more general Homeland Security stuff. Both those two are the largest law enforcement agencies in the federal government. It's not close. Despite not having existed as standalone agencies before 9/11, they've quickly become very, very large. And the federal government has has prosecuted more people for immigration offenses than it has for basically any other crime since, and this is going back to the Bush administration. So that's definitely a part of it. But there's also a part of it in which immigration is an international regional issue. And we've seen a lot of that over the last several years as there's been a lot of attention to the inflow of people, mostly from Central America, particularly Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, primarily families, many of them coming to ask for asylum in the United States. That has certainly spurred a lot of aggressive policymaking on the part of the aggressive deterrence measures, really, on the part of the Trump administration, kind of starting with family separation in spring of 2018, or at least kind of erupting into view at that point. And then after that policy was, reversed first because they were losing the political battle and then permanently put a hold in court, the successors to that effort have also focused on deterrence, but focused on keeping people from entering the US to begin with. And so starting in early 2019, with the Remain in Mexico or MPP policy, which the Supreme Court just agreed to hear a case over, even though it's been, in effect for a year and a half and has now been kind of replaced by some of the subsequent measures that have been enacted under the pandemic. So with the MPP program, then a few pilot programs in late 2019 that were just rapid deportation programs, with the Remain in Mexico program being for people who got court dates in the US theoretically, but had to wait in Mexico for those court dates and then get kind of ferried back and forth through the ports. The rapid deportation pilots were like, no, we're not going to give you a court date at all. We're going to resolve your case in a matter of a couple of weeks. And then with the cooperative agreements that have been signed, if in most cases not really enacted, with Central American countries in late last year and early this year, which allow the US to say to people who are coming to seek asylum here, no, 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 no. You passed through Guatemala on your way, and you're not Guatemalan, so we're not sending you back to the government you're saying persecuted you, but you're from Honduras or El Salvador and you came through Guatemala to get here. No, 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 you're gonna go back to Guatemala to apply for asylum instead. That agreement resulted in about 1,000 people getting sent back before the pandemic hit. Similar agreements with Honduras and El Salvador have still not been put in place. And then, of course, the pandemic itself, has allowed the Trump administration to put this new CDC order, it's now been 7 months, CDC order in place that says that because of the risk of introducing an infectious disease into the US, that Border Patrol agents have the power to just expel without any effort to interrogate whether they have an asylum claim, whether they might be eligible for relief, whether they would be facing persecution, to just quickly expel them either back to Mexico or to their home country. And so in all of these regards, you can see that there's part of this is about the US and its own domestic policies, but part of it is also about what other countries are doing. What can the US get the Mexican government and Central American governments to agree to? What are the priorities that it's letting fall by the wayside as Donald Trump is over there banging on the Twitter machine saying, well, if I want to raise tariffs on Mexico, but if they start apprehending migrants who are coming through, then I'll let up. What are the priorities that the US could be putting on the US-Mexico relationship? What are the things that they could be making sure that Mexico does to take care of migrants? That because the calculus is that they need to be, that the US is going to spend all its political capital on crackdown, those things aren't being discussed. So that's definitely a component of it that I think we've started to get a slightly better sense of I think many members of the public have started to understand that a little bit better under the Trump administration, partly because the very first crisis of the Trump administration on immigration was the first version of the travel ban. And that gave a lot of people a very quick window into how disjointed and often arbitrary the process of being allowed to enter the United States is to begin with, and how intertwined it can become with relationships between governments. One of the really big ironies of the Trump administration is that, Trump has always had this idea that governments send their people and people are a reflection of their governments. From Mexico, they're not sending their best people, to when Trump talks about the diversity visa, he talks about it as a way for countries to offload, the least desirable of their people. That's not only not how things generally work, but it's resulted, especially when it comes to asylum and refugee admissions, in people being either turned away because their governments are telling the US they don't want them to leave, as often happens when we talk about unaccompanied kids. Any government official will say, we want unaccompanied kids to be back with their parents when their parents may have made the decision to send them to the US to begin with. Or there's you are trying to flee the oppression of your government, but because of your government, the US isn't allowing you in. And we've seen that with, the damage that's been done to the refugee program, especially from Muslim majority countries, including religious minorities, which was supposed to be a thing that that conservatives in the Trump administration were very keen on. Anyway, that and there are a lot of kind of smaller international disputes that can kind of come up in that. And then there's a respect in which the immigration bureaucracy is supposed to be just a standard benefits granting agency, right? They're supposed to be taking applications from people who have been living in the US and have qualified for green cards, people who have green cards and are trying to become citizens, people who are abroad, but who have relatives in the US who are trying to sponsor them in, people who want, work visas, people who want to come to the US to study. That's supposed to be a fairly straightforward, boring bureaucratic process. And it hasn't been. And there's still a very open question as to the extent to which that's because the Trump administration has meddled in what was previously a relatively political process. Many of the kind of quieter changes that were made in the first couple of years of the Trump administration were to legal immigration applications. Things like you shouldn't, if you aren't certain about whether to demand more evidence before you approve something, then you definitely should demand more evidence. Or if you don't think there's enough evidence, you should just reject it instead of giving somebody another chance. There was, I think the best known example of this was the public charge regulation that was put into effect in most of the country as of the end of last year, which gives a lot of power to frontline immigration bureaucrats in U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to determine whether someone is going to be in the future in need of public assistance and deny them a green card based on that. It was presented, because things need to be kind of clear to be simple, to be understood. It was presented as if you've used welfare, then you won't be able to get a green card, but it's actually a lot more complicated and arbitrary than that, which makes it kind of hard to talk about to people who could be affected by it. And then this year, with the Trump administration wildly restricting legal immigration under the cover of COVID, saying that they would not be processing any more permanent immigration applications from people outside the country who were coming to live with family members, vastly restricting student visas and certain work visas, including, in cases where for a while actually restricting people who were supposed to be working in hospitals where they would be dealing with COVID cases. Between that and the fact that fewer people were able to apply anyway, there was a massive economic crunch. Field offices were closed for interviews for a while, so there was less incentive to send in your application. The agency, USCIS, that processes those applications is funded by fees. It's not funded by congressional revenues. And so for a period there, it looked like right around this time, the agency that was responsible for processing people's immigration applications was just going to kind of grind to a halt. They were going to have to furlough the overwhelming majority of their employees. That has been temporarily averted, but it's certainly something that is going to be relevant in, the next several years, both because we're talking about a bureaucracy which takes a long time to either show any kind of crisis or build back up afterwards, and because, if President Trump is reelected, it would be reasonable to assume the same attitudes toward legal immigration that we've seen. If Vice President Biden is elected, there's probably going to be a lot of pressure on these same agencies to adopt aggressive new policies, which will be more of a workload difficulty for them than they might have been otherwise. So, I'm not trying to give a 360-degree view. Obviously, I haven't even talked about DACA, for example, but that's a decent rundown of some of the things that I think a lot of us have had to become quick experts in, or start thinking about because we see something about them coming down the pike in, a couple of weeks from now. One of the true benefits of this administration as a reporter is that things leak And so it's very hard. It's been very unusual for this administration to pull anything out that we weren't already, that we hadn't already heard anything about. But because there's so much happening, you don't just have to fight the fact that if the president is tweeting about it, it's much harder to get people to pay attention, although that's true. Or like if it's not happening on US soil, it's much harder to get people to pay attention, which is true and something that's, I think, annoyed a lot of us as we've seen the Remain in Mexico policy and successor policies become much better entrenched. It's also that because some of the people who we are speaking to as the media are also people who are affected by these policies, it's really incumbent on us as the media to be clear in what people can expect and how it's going to affect them, even when the policies themselves are not, at least being clear about this isn't determined. And it means that we have to navigate the difficulty of understanding that people are very afraid. People have been afraid, even before this administration, but that there is a very broad fear, regardless of legal status, among many, many immigrants as to whether they have a permanent future in the US. And to talk honestly about the ways in which, immigration is being enforced more aggressively, the ways in which it isn't. Internal deportations are still not where they were even at the beginning of the Obama administration. The kind of large scale raids that the Trump administration has tooted about, tooted its horn about a couple of times, haven't really resulted in high, they have not yet found a way to do that actually results in people getting caught up. But to talk about that in a way that also that understands that you're not necessarily telling people how to feel, that you're telling people about things so that they can make their decisions about their lives and giving them the best information to do that. But understanding that you have both the obligation to kind of reflect what is going on in immigrant communities into the wider world, and the obligation not to just let that become a feedback loop in which people are, freaking each other out and becoming paralyzed with indecision just because they don't necessarily have all the information that our job as journalists has to be to bring some of that to them.
Thanks, Dara. That was an amazing, you said it wasn't a 360-degree kind of like perspective, but first of all, it reminds me how much work your job entails, because you've got to keep track of all of these different layers. You've got to and you have to explain things for us, the general public. I totally appreciate the explainers that you've often done. So often, we see a tweet, we see an announcement that a policy's come out, and then, like, seriously, I go to your Twitter feed. Okay, what does this really mean? And your policy explainers have been really, really helpful. One thing that I think is made clear from your, really brief remarks is, even though immigration is not as high up of an issue this time around, the stakes are so high because there are going to be so many issues that are not simply going to go away, even if Trump is not reelected, but that if there's a Biden administration, they are really going to have to grapple with an extreme, rightward move of policy. And how important this continued immigration coverage is, because most people don't know that immigration has dropped by 92%,
right?
At the second end of the fiscal year. So let me transition over to the conversation part between you and Ibrahim Hirsi. I'm going to introduce Ibrahim now. For those of you who are part of the IHRC community, you will already know Ibrahim for his work at the IHRC. He's a third-year PhD student in modern US history. He's also been a longtime immigration reporter for NPR, for MinnPost, and most recently for the Sahan Journal. He is also leading up our efforts at the IHRC to collect stories from immigrants and refugees affected by COVID as part of our Immigrants and COVID America project. and a partnership with Sahan. So thank you, Ibrahim, for joining us as well. I wanted to ask the first, I'm going to bundle up two questions. I'm going to ask the first two questions of both of you to help us get started on the conversation. And the first one's an easy one. It's, how did you both become reporters covering immigration? And then I wanted to ask you to follow up with, how has your work, how has the reporting work changed during the pandemic? What stories are you covering? What new methods have you had to employ? What challenges have there been? Ibrahim, you just published an article in Digital Story about a local candidate running for office without being able to shake hands or have big campaign events. Dara, you seem busier than ever keeping track of the multiple changes in policy that seem to be sort of happening under the radar because it's the pandemic. So how has how has this all changed for you guys? And what also drove you to first do this great work of reporting on immigration?
Yeah, oh, I mean, like, I kind of feel like I'm still in a way in the process of becoming a real reporter on immigration. I was working on the issue before I was in journalism, you know, going back to when I was interested in it in college, and just I was interning at a nonprofit at one point, and you know, the thing that kept coming up in conversations with school districts was, well, the biggest challenge we face in outreach to the families in our district is that the parents won't come into school because they're afraid that they'll get arrested if they're on school grounds. And this is like 2006. And it just became very clear to me that this was so fundamental to every other issue that people might encounter when trying to deal with the world and trying to deal with government bodies. But I ended up I was working at a nonprofit here in DC for several years on immigration, kind of trying to break into journalism, but not trying, you know, not being willing to like quit my job and try to become an immigration reporter instead, and managed to luck into starting at Vox when it launched, because at that time, you know, the founders of Vox were trying to put together people who knew a lot about their respective issue areas and didn't have to be paid a ton. And so I was able to kind of, as someone who wouldn't necessarily have been able to you know, still very early career, wasn't like trying to be a diva about things, was willing to throw myself into something new, build on the way up. And when I went to ProPublica, I did so in large part so that I could kind of backfill some of the basic reporting skills I'd never had, like going out on reporting trips and talking to people and like seeing parts of the world and being able to really, you know, embed with people in their daily lives. And that has not happened at all for obvious reasons because COVID. So reporting right now feels a little bit more like what I'm used to, like everything is filtered through my computer. And if I manage to get a hold of people, then that's great. Otherwise, but it's certainly been very frustrating to me because I can't do what I'm used to doing, which is taking advantage of the very smart, very observant people who are on the ground, and then trying to like synthesize what all I'm hearing from the local reporters. There's just been so much opacity around what's going on at the border right now because people aren't able to cross from the US into Mexico easily. And so that has been, you know, you've definitely felt that all the way up because that stuff isn't happening in local and community journalism. People like me can't necessarily offer a whole lot of insight into what the big picture looks like, which means that the people who are actually making the decisions, or, you know, who have larger platforms to direct attention, are, you know, aren't able to pay attention to it because they don't have any visibility into what's going on.
Oh, great. Thank you very much, Dara, for that insight. And thank you, Dr. Lee, for the introduction. So how did I get into immigration reporting? I think it started with high school. I went to a Minneapolis public school where everybody was an immigrant from Somalia, Ethiopia, France, Central America, West Africa, Southeast Asia, all over the place. We had our small, United Nations there. And I started a newspaper there, and my main thing was to, even though I really didn't really have a solid training in journalism, of course, I was still in high school. I just wanted to write stuff and share the experiences and different cultures of young students there. And then after that, I went to the U, studied journalism, worked for the Minnesota Daily. And even though they wanted me to do, the little kind of boring stuff that every student journalist does, I always wanted to write about immigration. So I would really force squeeze the stories on immigration. And eventually I just became the guy who covers immigration. And I think that's what I'm doing today. And how did COVID, change the way we write about immigration and immigrant stories? It changed really a lot. I mean, now, initially I would write about maybe just policies or general politicians and what they're doing. But now you can't really write any story without connecting it to COVID, because that's the main thing that's happening. Especially, this was especially true in the summer and May, when I started doing this work after my spring semester at the U. So we found ourselves doing stories on, how immigrant business owners are affected by COVID. We did a story about a candidate called Obala Obala in Austin, Minnesota, who's running for city council there, Ethiopian American. And we did a story on, the latest story that we did was in partnership with the Immigration History Research Center, was how are these candidates dealing with COVID? I mean, for example, this Obala Obala, politician, one thing, like many candidates that he's doing, is he can't hold public events. He can't do the typical door knocking. Everything is on social media these days. And also another way that it changed the way we do reporting is that, I mean, I don't know about you, Dara. I'm sure you would like to meet your subjects in person and get these beautiful colors in this story, in addition to the great things that they tell you. And we couldn't, I mean, I did a story on Ilhan Omar, Representative Ilhan Omar, before, I think a couple of days before the primaries. And I wanted to get her perspective on, just what she did with immigration in her first term in Congress. And I mean, we eventually did that story, and I spoke with her for 40 minutes, but over the phone. But with stories like this, which is very important, I would have kind of prioritized meeting the person in person and getting this. So that's not really happening now because of COVID. But I wanted to turn to you now. When we talk about immigration and covering immigrants, we're talking about a large population of people. We're talking about 40 million people who were born outside of the United States. That is, if you put it in a very simple way, population of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 states: Minnesota, Ohio, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan. If you combine the population of all these four, that's about 40 million. So if you would bring all these immigrants together who were born outside of the United States, we would fill 5 states. And I'm not counting second generation immigrants. What I've always thought about is in Minnesota, of course, we have really great news organizations, but also we have a large population of immigrants from Southeast Asia, Africa, especially East Africa, Ethiopia and Somalia. Of course, Mexico, Central America, all these different immigrants, including people from Russia who came after the Cold War ended, or after the Soviet Union collapsed. And for the past 15 years that I lived in Minnesota, I haven't really seen, I mean, of course, there are reporters who are doing some immigration work, but they're also doing, in addition to immigration, they're also covering, environment or workforce or race and class and all these things. So they would probably like have maybe one story a month. That's all they can do with the time they have. In other words, we haven't really seen um, um, executives who are investing in full-time reporters just covering immigration. Of course, that's with the exception of Sahani Journal, a great news organization that was born in Minnesota just about a year and a half ago, which doesn't do anything else but immigration. So that's the exception of that. But I'm talking about other news organizations. And I've been thinking about this for a while, and I wanted to understand if you see similar trends on a national level.
Yes. I feel like it's usually a fight at anything other than a super, super, super major, ginormous newsroom to be able to devote yourself full time to immigration, to vastly oversimplify the way that I think editors in DC tend to approach it, until really the Trump administration. It was seen as a culture war issue instead of a policy issue, which means that, like, yeah, you'll cover it when somebody says something on the campaign trail, or like you'll cover it when it's in the context of like, will you be able to turn out this voter block because they like what you're saying? But you're not going to talk about it as a government machinery that affects people. That's changed under Trump because it has to. I'm not sure if it's a permanent change. Like, my joke, not joke, has been that I'm worried that if Joe Biden is elected and inaugurated on January 21st, 2021, that like the next day there will be this Thanos snap and half the immigration reporters in DC are going to lose their gigs, because I do think that there's, I'm not sure that there's the kind of desire for full-time, coverage at the level we've seen when it's not as salient an issue to somebody's presidency, when it's not as politically top of mind. Part of that, frankly, is that it's not always easy to find the audience for this stuff. The thing that, where I think local and community focused news organizations have an easier time of it than national ones is, to a certain extent, if you're really trying to get audience, you have to be relying on getting a large, you have to be relying on it being a largely white audience, or you have to be doing a lot of work into trying to put together, because obviously, as much as we can talk about how immigrants in the aggregate would be multiple states, talking about immigrants in the aggregate itself doesn't help a lot, as Minnesota really demonstrates. The stereotypical conversations about like immigrants as undocumented, immigrants as Latinos, like really doesn't help understand what's going on for y'all in particular. And figuring out the balance between representing the diversity of something and and making it kind of coherent for a broader audience, for a largely white audience. Also, frankly, figuring out the balance between things that are going to draw attention and therefore make it easier for you to justify continuing to cover the issue, while really not wanting to lean too much into trauma porn, while being very cognizant that if you put a headline on something that is going to make someone feel afraid, and the reality of that article doesn't bear it out, that you are almost certainly going to end up having to fight with your editor or fight with somebody else in your organization, or just kind of make it clear at the outset that I'm not going to put that on because I'm worried about X, Y, and Z. It can sometimes feel like, the most recent example of this was when there was a story that went viral about mass hysterectomies in an ICE facility in Georgia. And that was based on a an allegation in the midst of a whistleblower complaint about something else that had been filed in a court case. And a lot of extremely good reporters went in and did the work of on-the-ground reporting and demonstrated that there was a pattern of women being operated on without their consent, and that there were concerns about one doctor in particular, but that the initial stories of mass hysterectomies, which kind of implied ICE going through every woman in detention and making it impossible for her to give birth, those stories weren't supported. When you do that work, you have to acknowledge that it's not going to get the eyeballs that the first round of reporting did. And you have to be able to justify both to yourself that like, that's still a worthwhile thing to do, and to, you know, your editor and the powers that be that are going to be harder to persuade on a story that is, you know, this really outrageous thing, I want to throw a bunch of cold water on that. Or like, I want to, you know, I want to make it seem like something isn't a big deal. That's always a big bias in journalism that, you know, communicating to people makes it hard to cut against. This is something I think about a lot, you know, in that, like, that I think is different for y'all, but I think is still very relevant. Like, what do you do in cases like, I think raids is a really good example, right? Like when you know that people who you are communicating with are very afraid, and you know that that fear is not groundless, but you also want to communicate to them what is known about what's going to happen and who is and isn't necessarily at the most risk of getting caught up.
Yeah. I mean, for me, when I was working with Science Journal this summer, and it was me and another 5 full-timers, and we thought, you know, we could just get all the story ideas that we were thinking about over the summer, and I can just get out of there, you know, and start the school in the fall. But I couldn't believe how much immigration stories were out there, that even an entire organization that just covers immigration can't really tell all those stories. I mean, the more I think about all these things, the more I realize, but that's not really, you know, what many people who, you know, who lead these organizations really think. They think that maybe there isn't really a lot of stories there. If there is this, you know, DACA and these major policies that everybody's talking about, then there isn't really nothing to talk about. Or maybe there's this assumption that there isn't really audience there who are interested in these stories. But again, like when you look at local stuff and the stories that we write, it's just completely mind-blowing how people, number one, want to read about, but also number two, the amount of the stories that are there that are really not told yet or silenced. But I wanted to also, I know that you have been covering immigration for a while now. There was the George W. Bush administration, and then you had 8 years of Obama, and then now you have 4 years of, almost 4 years of Donald Trump. What was it like to cover immigration under Obama, and has your coverage changed since Trump took office?
I mean, for a while, the version of this question that I was getting asked was, oh, is it a lot harder to report on the federal government now that Trump is in office and they won't talk to press? And my response to that was, the Obama administration didn't like talking to me much either. They were very upset at anybody, you know, because there was a dynamic, especially in the first term of the Obama administration, in which there was a very aggressive posture on immigration enforcement for the purposes of trying to get Congress to accept that Democrats could be trusted on border security and therefore pass comprehensive immigration reform. So this sort of thing was happening, but then when there was any kind of pointing that out from the left or center left, or anything in the media that made it clear that, you know, just how much at what a high watermark immigration enforcement had been, they got very, very mad about that. So, you know, in some ways, I think it's even the playing field a little bit. There have been so many of us who have gotten little bits and pieces of what's coming or of what's happening, because, a lot of people out there who are in some way involved are alarmed for one reason or another and want to blow the whistle. Uh, I think that there was a period, I think in 2017, in particular, 2017, 2018, when it felt like there was a real opportunity to level up how, to be super like oversimplifying about it, how white liberals understood immigration policy, right? It kind of seemed like there was an opening there where that particular group of people who hadn't previously been thinking a lot about the issue now was thinking a lot about the issue. And so it was like, all right, let's quick cram the last 20, 30 years of immigration policy into everybody's head before they stop paying attention again. That I think is less, I mean, it just like the pandemic has taken bandwidth away from that, like it has for everything else. And it now seems like immigration is kind of fighting for oxygen a little more. But I think that that's certainly been something that I was attuned to when that transition happened. I will also say, frankly, that I personally feel a little bit more drawn by the traditional journalistic code of, not like of impartiality in public than I was previously, because the fact of the matter is that what has happened in many of the things that have happened under this administration are things that the people who are outraged by them see them as self-evidently outrageous. They don't actually need someone tacking something saying, and this is bad, onto a story about families getting separated or women being operated on without their consent or anything like that. And so that, and instead of, if you don't have to do that, if you feel that if you understand that as being like somebody else's job to read into your story, there's a little more leeway you have in terms of, that gives you a little more space to talk about information, gives you a little more space to acknowledge nuance. It gives you a little bit more ability to talk to, on the sourcing side, as well as in your audience, people who may not necessarily, agree with your conclusions if you were to explicitly draw them. And the longer that I'm in this, the longer that I'm on this beat, the more I appreciate that even just to understand what is going on, you need to have enough of a line of communication to a broad enough array of people that, you just forwarding that, putting the information out there has to be the goal, rather than making sure that anything you say is said with the properly titrated amount of emotion.
And I think you got to this, but there's something that I've always thought about, and I saw this in my reporting as well. So, let's say you're doing a story on immigration, and there's this very anti-immigration, very racist person wanting to write these policies and saying all these things about, immigrants and immigration. For example, we saw, why don't we get enough immigration from Norway? Why these shithole countries? Things like that. And as a reporter, when you're doing these stories, depending on who your editors are. I mean, there are editors who genuinely believe objectivity, and that they will tell you, what, if you get this part of this side of the story, you also need to find this side of the story, which means find an organization that's very anti-immigration, very racist, just to balance the story. And I wondered how you deal with that, or if you get a pushback, not only with your organization currently, but throughout your career. And what is your take on? I mean, do you try to find this other side of the story when you know what they're saying is probably very racist?
One of the things that I really like about explanatory journalism in particular is that it's a genre that doesn't do what I call like dial a quote, right? Like it's not a thing where it's like, okay, who are the groups who have a stake in the outcome of this story, who I need to like include their perspective, not by actually laying out what their stake in it is, but just having them have a quote in there so they can give their top talking point, and then we'll move on. There is an obligation to represent who the players are and what their goals are. But there's kind of a there's like a cheap way to to talk about this, which is that I can use what's called in journalism the voice of God a lot. I can just say, these group of people believe, and as long as it's not like, if it's a fair representation of what they believe, they're not going to call me up and be like, well, you paraphrased us instead of quoting us. So I think that does get around some of the issues that's an easy way around the kind of the false balance thing, which is, generally kind of a mix of which views should be like who gets to have a quote in your article, who gets to be represented in that particular way. It doesn't get around the like, okay, but they still have a stake in this debate. I think I'm okay with that personally. Like, I'm not sure that as a journalist it's even effective for me to say, oh, well, if I don't explain your role in this story in my piece, then it's like you don't have a role in it. Like, obviously, if everyone agreed that Stephen Miller didn't exist, Stephen Miller would still exist. But, I think when it comes to that it's really important to just be specific. I don't care as much about like whether or not you call someone racist or xenophobic or white nationalist, as I know a lot of other people do. And I think that I will like fully stipulate that I'm not going to say that I'm correct about that. It's entirely possible that this is just like, this is like in part white privilege, in part my trying to kick against a reputation of having come from advocacy or come from a liberal news organization. But I generally think, like, in a lot of journalistic style guides, if you look up how are you supposed to refer to people who are coming without papers, they'll say, well, okay, here are some terms, like, don't use illegal aliens, but if you're writing about a specific person, tell that person's story. Like, don't say that, it's less important to whether you call them an undocumented immigrant or an unauthorized immigrant or whatever, than it is to say that, like, they came from Nigeria with their family when they were 6 and they overstayed a tourist visa, or like something like that. And I think something similar is true when we're talking about, far right ideologies. It's less helpful for me to say, like, okay, when you're talking about Stephen Miller, do you, like, what label do you use, than to say, like, Stephen Miller, who has been the driving force behind the Trump administration's restrictionist immigration agenda, or Stephen Miller, who has for a long time had a particular desire to restrict and and deter use of public benefits among immigrants, or like other things that we know that are either in the public record or have been broadly reported. I think that that's what really helps give the audience a sense that you're not just kind of leading them through this story, you're giving them information that they can also apply in other contexts. And the more specific you can be, especially if you can manage being both specific and concise, the more likely it is that you're giving them something that is going to be not just kind of listened to and appreciated that they listened to it, but like actually actually remembered and used.
Mm-hmm. And another question that I was thinking about is, I mean, we all, like, when you're an immigration reporter, you're dealing with sources that are vulnerable. They include people who don't speak the language, people who don't understand, American journalism, people who don't have legal documents. But at the same time, you want them to open up to you so that you can tell their story. But at the same time, there's like, should I say their names, first name, last name? I wanted to understand a little bit more about how you deal with this kind of negotiation, whether it's taking their pictures or saying their names, and what avenue do you take to really get them open to you? Because the most important job that you have is to tell their story justly. And how do you do that when there's all these other fears and layers?
This is something that I not only don't feel I have all the answers to, but feel like I'm probably like, you're probably actually a better person to answer this question than I am, because I often feel in these circumstances like I'm just not very, I often feel inadequate to interactions like this. I generally take the attitude that what's really important is getting the story out there, and that I'm very willing to make concessions on anonymity in particular, if that's what's necessary to get it out. I think that the harder considerations are cases where it even if you sufficiently anonymize someone, there just isn't a benefit to them of the story coming out. Like they may want to share their story with someone, they may not want to share their story with someone. But even if they do, they may have made the assessment, or their lawyer may have made the assessment, because often, when people are represented by lawyers, that's another party in the conversation, and they're not, the lawyer has their own calculus of what media coverage will and won't do. It's hard to tell someone, yes, the only effect of this coming out might be a slight risk that things go badly for you, but it's still really important that it happened. And that's where you have to try to figure out, okay, what are since we know this is happening to people, what are the compelling, like how do we find people who this is happening to, and who have a compelling enough set of circumstances for like people to want to hear their story, even though they don't know everything about them, but who are willing to speak. And like, that's really freaking hard. I think that it's often very difficult to ask people to go back again and again and again to traumatic experiences. That said, when I'm writing a piece, when I'm reading, when I'm listening back to my interviews after the fact, I'm always frustrated that I don't ask more follow-up questions and ask for more details, that I don't push them to like really describe what they were going through more, because that's when I run up against, oh, I can't really communicate this well because I wasn't brave enough to ask questions. And so I can't really serve my audience. That can be really, like, it's always very, I'm trying to figure out when in the moment to listen to this is difficult, you should pull back and be a good person instinct, and when to listen to no, this is really, really important for people to hear. We need to know more about what was happening, when this was going, like, we need to hear more about what was going through this person's head during this moment.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I remember doing a story on a woman whose husband got picked up by ICE in front of the courthouse, and her husband was in detention at the time. And she reached out to us, and she wanted us to tell her story, but she was the only person, the main sources that I had, in addition to legal and court documents. And it was really very difficult to tell that story without at least having at least a first name or last name, but she didn't want to give us her name. And one of her main reasons was that people know me, my kids go to school. I don't want to, their parents and their children and the kids that they play with to know that their dad is undocumented and is being deported, which is very difficult. I think eventually it took us a couple of days, but she was able to share her name with us, and I think the story went really well. But I agree, it's really difficult, and it depends from case to case.
It's again the kind of problem of like, when are you writing for the community of your subjects, and when are you writing for a community that, like might be more like a bigger community that wouldn't be interacting with these people. In that case, the alternative to writing that story would be to allow a lot of people to just go through their days not knowing that ICE had picked up this dude, and like, maybe it would be more comfortable for them. But yeah, it's really difficult to ask people to like serve up their trauma for public gain.
Yeah. Dara, we will continue this conversation now. We will turn to audience questions.
Great. We've got a bunch of questions coming in. So the first one is from our friend Donna Gabatia up at the University of Toronto, and she wants to ask, Amy Coney Barrett may be sitting on the court when it hears the case about excluding undocumented persons from census counts. I should add that it's Undocumented Student Action Week this week. And Donna says, we know quite a lot about Barrett's likely perspectives on other issues. Any insight into where she's likely to come down on the census undocumented question?
I will say straight up that I have not done any independent reporting into this, so I am relying on the assessments of people who are, more informed than I am in other reporting and on Twitter. The immigration jurisprudence that Amy Coney Barrett has is not as extremely clear cut as as your image of it would be, right? Like the assumption would be that you'd see a lot of rulings in favor of the government and against, either in favor of the Trump administration against lawsuits, or in favor of the government and against immigrants in cases where it's about when can you be deported and what are your rights. There is some of that, to be sure. There is a little bit of ambiguity there, which is interesting because her predecessors in appointment to the Supreme Court, Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, are both closely associated with a school of jurisprudence that really wants to give the executive branch less discretion in how to interpret the law. And while that generally cuts in a stereotypically conservative direction, in immigration cases, it can result in rulings that are, no, the government can't just say that this is a crime that is bad enough to deport someone. You have to actually demonstrate that there is a pattern, a pattern of facts there. You can't just say that this person is a flight risk and therefore you can't release them for months and months. So it's not, that kind of streak isn't really apparent, in her, but it's not something that can be totally denied. That said, she did have one of the key rulings upholding the public charge regulation, which is probably a decent proxy for the census in terms of it's a power that the federal government is understood to have and that the executive branch is understood to have. And the question is this particular iteration of that power designed to disproportionately harm communities of color? And if you're saying it, if it's difficult to imagine that the argument wouldn't have been there for the public charge regulation, but would be there for the census. I could come up with one in my head, but I don't think it's something many people would agree with.
Okay, next question is from Anjali Shah, who you both know, another immigration reporter. And she asks, in your ideal world, what does that even mean anymore? In your ideal world, what does national immigration coverage look like and who does it serve? How does the legacy of exclusion of people of color from news media affect your work? Ibrahim, do you want to start with that one and then Dara can answer after?
Yeah, that would be a perfect question for Dara. I haven't been paying a lot of attention to national coverage, but I mean, for me, the things that we have been dealing with as people have been covering local stuff for a while is something happens in Minnesota and people parachute come here. I mean, one example that I can share with all of you here is the story of young Somalis who were caught trying to join ISIS some years back. And everybody came and just wrote whatever they want, and then they left, and nobody came back to do any follow-up explaining what this is all about. And we see a lot of those happening, even with the national stories that we see. I mean, it's just the same thing. If it doesn't happen in Minneapolis, it's happening in Chicago, it's happening in LA. And for me, what I see an important coverage is having, a number of people working in national news organizations dedicated to telling the stories of immigration and immigrants. And I mean, a lot of times people think of who are the subscribers of this news organization, who pay the bills of these reporters, and if that happens to be white, and they are serving white folks, which means immigration stories is always silenced, and the only time that it's told is when they parachute and say, "These Somali kids this is how they're doing, and this is how dangerous they are." And I think that's, for me, a very dangerous journalism. An ideal world, I think, as I said, is to have people who are doing this full time and dedicated reporters focusing on immigration.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is complicated for me as a white woman who's been fortunate to get paid to write about immigration for the last several years. There is absolutely a sense in which any platform or space that I have is theoretically could be at the expense of someone who is from an affected community, a reporter of color, someone first generation, or who has, you know, much closer personal ties than I do. That's something that, like, it's worth bearing as an individual responsibility, because I can't change the course of, like, national media, but I can, you know, can control what I personally do. But I think the other thing that really strikes me is I don't want a world in which, if you're a policy reporter and you're a person of color, especially because this is the way that, like, newsroom brain works, especially if you're a, like, Spanish speaking Latino, then you'll get, you know, shunted into immigration. What if what you really want to do is, like, nuclear energy policy? And I also don't want a world where it's assumed that the role of journalists of color is to bear witness to trauma and package it for, even, like, you know, packaging it for white audiences is, like, a separate problem. But I don't want something in which people are being used as kind of frontline emotional kind of emotional soldiers. I think that there's a very important role to be played by the press in dealing with, in packaging things clearly enough and concisely enough that people can read it and move on, that they don't need to spend a lot of their time, like, learning more and trying to figure out what's going on and thinking about it. Obviously, we can't control how much someone thinks about something, you know, like mulls over it, or what their emotional response is. But I do think, and, you know, while this isn't an ideal world thing, I think in the world that we live in, local coverage, especially local Spanish language coverage, has really gotten, like, noticeably worse, even in the time I've been in journalism. And what that means is that the, like, two people who are running a newspaper don't have time to do reporting themselves. They're writing off what they're hearing in national news. So there is this weirdly roundabout way in which those of us in kind of, like, elite national positions, especially, you know, the reputation that I'm fortunate enough to have, where I think a lot of people are looking at my work to figure out what the most accurate way they can describe things is, that there is this kind of bank shot into helping people who don't have the, you know, the resources, or whose job it isn't to be living this stuff full time. And, you know, there's I think also the fact that it is important to make sure that people who aren't directly affected are aware of what's going on, but are also aware that, but are also kind of being inspired to pay attention to it, not because it's, like, particularly, you know, sentimental or heartrending, but because it's important. And that's kind of, I think, where, like, the idealness comes in. Like, I would love for a world in which every immigration story, every demographic story, were treated as seriously as a healthcare or a budget story. That's really the goal in terms of, like, the things that get considered serious just because they're serious. I think short of that, and that's, you know, partly on political elites, partly on journalistic elites, partly on, you know, like, social media, it's there will always be there will always be a necessary role in trying to make sure that people have the best information possible in the shortest time.
Okay, I think this is going to be our last question, and it helps us think ahead to perhaps better times, maybe not ideal. I feel like if we can just survive, that's going to be the best, the most realistic scenario. I'm going to combine a question from Adam Goodman, historian, author, University of Illinois, Chicago, and a question that I thought I would pose as the last one. So Adam notes that there have been over 400 changes to immigration policy during the Trump administration. what are some, based on your reporting, that stand out as particularly egregious? And then thinking ahead, how easy will these policies be to, how easy will these policies be to be overturned after the election if there's a Biden administration? What should we, as readers of both of your work at the local and national level, what should we be looking forward to on immigration coverage after the election?
I mean, I've been doing a little reporting into the kind of how easy are things going to be to overturn question, and the answer is that there's a really broad spectrum just because there have been so many changes on so many different levels. You know, as a general rule, the stuff that the Trump administration has tried and has been losing in court on, it's a lot easier to just drop that case if you're a Biden DOJ on day one. There's stuff that there are, like, in the regulatory process, because of there being a set by law procedure to follow, it's difficult to get that stuff overturned. A lot of the trickier stuff is what happens to kind of like personnel and training and what internal norms are, because those are things that theoretically can be changed, but would require very motivated people doing them and receptive people on the ground. And so I think what I'd be looking at, you know, if it should Biden win the election from a reader standpoint, is don't discount stories that are about what politicians or people who are in the top levels of the executive branch say is happening, especially on immigration enforcement. We saw during the Obama administration that what was coming out of the White House was rhetoric about who they thought should and shouldn't be targeted for deportation, not who actually was. So, you know, kind of understand that enough of this is set on the ground that you're going to want to see, you know, either statements from the kind of local managers to the extent that those are available, or really like seeing how it plays out. You know, there are obviously there are caveats there, but I think that it's going to, it took the Obama administration 6 years to come up with enforcement priorities that they actually got, you know, ICE agents to sign off on, and it upset them so much that they turned around and endorsed Donald Trump. So I think, you know, we're going to see, I think it's easy to understate the extent to which a post-Trump administration could change things, but in that regard in particular, I think it's worth being a very cautious news consumer.
Yeah, it's really good. For me, so what is the most egregious policy that has stood out for me? I mean, I think everything that he wrote that this administration implemented has been really very egregious. Each is different and even more difficult to deal with than the other. But one story that I wanted to share is when the travel ban happened in 2017, January. I think that was like the first week, the first Friday that he came to office. And even though people had some idea that, you know, the president was talking about banning Muslims from certain countries, throughout his campaign, people didn't really know that it was going to happen. They just thought that was just a campaign rhetoric, and that was pretty much it. This is a politician, he's better than this. You know, politicians say all these things, but when they actually get to the office, they don't do these kind of things, but he actually did. And one thing that I ask people, I mean, you know, a lot of liberals and Democrats talk about how Donald Trump really failed as a president, but he actually succeeded in his promises of anti-immigration. He's the most successful human being, I believe, when it comes to following through what he promised he would do, which is 92%. That was what Dr. Lee was saying of immigration is done now. You know, so the refugee process takes years. And there was this woman that I interviewed a day after this was written. She went through the process for 2 years. Her and her 2 kids. Her husband lived in Wilmer, Minnesota, and she was already on her way to Minnesota when this was signed. And of course, there was no policy that said that had I mean, so it was more like, okay, we're going to sign today and it will be implemented today. And this woman and her 2 kids get out of the airplane and they get detained. And that, I think it took them for 20 something hours to just be detained, even though she went through all the immigration process for 2 years and thought that she was all set to come to the United States. And of course, her husband was here and they were having this conversation during the process of coming here. And her husband used to tell her that, America is the land of the free. You can, succeed in this country and you can do all that you want in this country that your own country couldn't really give you. And I interviewed her later on, and she said that when the 20 hours happened, the first thing that she asked her husband was, why did you lie to me? Why did you tell me that this was the land of the free? Because right after I came, I was detained, even though I did everything right. And that still kind of stays with me, even though I wrote 3 years ago.
And the refugee resettlement program, the new numbers out for 2021 are 15,000 now, and we know the need is only greater. So thank you so much, Dara. Thank you, Ibrahim, for joining us. It's been a great conversation. I'm sorry to all the audience members for whom we didn't get to your questions, but I want to remind everyone, you can visit Dara's page on ProPublica for more. That was put into the chat earlier in the event, and it's just put in again. And then you can read and watch Ibrahim's latest story as part of our Immigrants in COVID America project as well. And that's going to go into the chat too. And if you liked this event, I hope that you'll come back in 3 weeks for our next event. It's the book launch of Kao Kalia Yang's new book, Somewhere in the Unknown World, a collective refugee memoir. It's Monday, November 16th, 2020. And we're going to put the registration link in the chat box as well, as a link to the COVID in Immigrants in COVID America project. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and stay well. Bye-bye.